The first warning came as a single thump in the darkness, a sound so heavy it seemed to shake the air before anyone could name it. It was just after dawn at Wanat, a small, newly built American outpost near the village of Wanat in Afghanistan's Nuristan province. Most of the soldiers were still trying to rest, lying on cots or leaning against half-built sandbag walls. The air was already warming, carrying the dusty scent of the Kunar River below. A few soldiers were outside checking equipment, thinking about breakfast, not expecting a fight so early. When the first RPG streaked overhead, everything changed. The outpost, officially called Vehicle Patrol Base Kahler, had only been in place for a few days. The 173rd Airborne soldiers knew the position was exposed. The walls weren't finished. Defensive wire covered only part of the perimeter. The observation post on a nearby terrace, occupied by a small detachment, sat on ground that gave a clear view but little real protection. There had been signs of enemy activity in the area for days. Locals acted nervous whenever soldiers approached the village. Intelligence warned that insurgents might try something, but no one predicted the scale of what was coming. At about 4:20 in the morning, more than 200 Taliban and Hezb-e-Islami fighters opened fire from ridgelines and from inside the village itself. The first wave of fire hit the perimeter with such force that soldiers thought the outpost was being pushed backward. Machine guns, RPGs, and AK-47s tore into anything that moved. The Americans scrambled for cover, diving behind sandbags and overturned crates. The sound of bullets hitting metal drowned out almost everything else. Radios exploded to life with shouted reports and requests for support. Within seconds, the outpost was surrounded. Near the entrance of the base, soldiers tried to get their heavy weapons operating, but the positions were so newly built that some guns were still being set up when the shooting started. The enemy fire was too accurate to ignore. Every time a soldier lifted his head to return fire, rounds cracked past his helmet. In the observation post above the main base, the small squad found themselves in an even worse position. Their rooftop platform had a good field of view, but it was nearly impossible to defend when waves of fighters closed in from multiple angles. As the sun lifted over the mountains, the volume of enemy fire only increased. RPGs slammed into the walls, sending splinters of wood and dust in every direction. One blast tore through a position where several soldiers had been firing, knocking them to the ground. Others crawled through the dirt trying to drag wounded men to safer cover. The medic moved constantly, shifting from one casualty to another, working in the open while rounds snapped past his sleeves. The observation post took several direct hits. Sandbags burst. Wooden beams cracked. Soldiers inside shouted for more ammunition while trying to keep the radio alive. Down in the main outpost, the company commander fought to coordinate air support. The request went out as soon as the attack began, but it took time for aircraft to reach the remote valley. Until then, the soldiers had to rely on their rifles, machine guns, and a few grenade launchers. Several soldiers attempted to man the .50 caliber machine gun, but each time they rose to fire, enemy rounds struck the mount or the shield in front of it. The gun jammed repeatedly under the pressure of dust, debris, and the constant need to fire. Enemy fighters advanced closer to the wire, using the terrain and village buildings for cover. Some tried to breach the perimeter. Soldiers shifted positions constantly, firing from collapsed corners and damaged barriers. The smell of burned gunpowder hung heavy in the air. The ground shook under the pressure of explosions. Every man understood how thin their margins had become. If the enemy poured through the wire in numbers, the outpost would fall. At the observation post, the situation reached a breaking point. The small team had been under continuous fire since the first minute, and now the structure around them was collapsing. One soldier was killed instantly by an RPG blast. Another fell trying to reach a better angle to fire. The survivors pulled back into a narrow trench, using dirt and whatever wreckage they could find as cover. They radioed that they were nearly out of ammunition. Their voices were strained, the static filled with both gunfire and shouting. Just when the enemy pressure seemed overwhelming, the first American aircraft arrived overhead. Attack helicopters banked hard through the valley, firing rockets at fighters on the ridgelines. The sudden roar of engines brought a surge of relief through the outpost. Air crews identified muzzle flashes and engaged targets, forcing enemy fighters to pull back from the perimeter. Minutes later, more aircraft arrived, creating a protective circle of fire around the outpost. It wasn't enough to end the battle, but it bought the soldiers time to regroup. On the ground, soldiers crawled out to recover wounded men lying in exposed areas. Some dragged casualties by their vests or belts while still returning fire. Others sprinted short distances between bursts of enemy fire, grabbing ammunition cans or repositioning guns. The medics worked inside a makeshift casualty area, applying tourniquets, stopping bleeding, and shouting updates to leadership. The radio traffic was constant. Requests for more air support, reports of enemy movement, updates on ammunition levels. By mid-morning, the enemy assault began to falter. Airstrikes hit key firing positions in the hills. Helicopters circled low, firing at groups of fighters trying to withdraw. The Americans pushed hard to re-establish control of the perimeter, shouting to one another as they moved between damaged walls and shattered bunkers. The gunfire didn't stop completely, but the pressure eased enough for soldiers to breathe without expecting an immediate explosion beside them. When the battle finally ended, the outpost was almost unrecognizable. Walls were blown apart. Ammunition boxes lay scattered and empty. Smoke drifted from burned sections of the perimeter. 9 American soldiers had been killed. More than 24 were wounded. It had become one of the deadliest engagements of the war in Afghanistan. Survivors stood in silence, taking in the destruction. Some walked the perimeter looking for anything salvageable. Others sat beside their fallen friends, unable to speak. In the weeks that followed, investigations examined why the outpost had been placed in such a vulnerable position and why intelligence warnings hadn't led to stronger defenses. Families received notifications back home, trying to understand how a fight at a place few had heard of became so costly. Soldiers who lived through the battle replayed the minutes in their minds, remembering the sounds, the flashes, the chaos, and the men who didn't make it out. The outpost at Wanat was eventually abandoned, and the battlefield returned to silence. But for the soldiers who fought there, the memory never faded. The valley, the ridgelines, the unfinished walls. They carried all of it home with them. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.